I've had some people ask me about some of the resources that we've either used or talked about. So I just want to show you where you'll be able to get those. This is our website homepage, Burning Hearts Disciples, both of those are plural, .org. And if you go, this is going to be challenging. All right. Right there on latest events, you'll see, right, June 2023, Diocese of Lafayette. You click on that, it's going to take you right here. The downloads section is coming soon because I'll put that up on Friday for the first session on mission and identity, along with some of the resources I talked about. Sherry Waddell's book, the Start with the Why, a couple of the church documents. And then down underneath that is proclaiming the good news. Okay, I'll have the slides up from the kerygma that we just did, along with a couple other, like a one-page kerygma, like outline, some different things like that. But this book, Jesus, the Story You Thought You Knew, which is linked right here on it, that is where that prayer came out of that we did. Okay? It's written by Deacon Keith Strom. Deacon Keith is from the Archdiocese of Chicago. We do a lot of work with him. And it's a shortened version of the one that's in that book is what we used. Jesus, the Story You Thought You Knew. But you can come find it right here and click on it, and there it is. Underneath that, there's also some resources for sharing the kerygma with adults, linked down here, and with children and teens. So there's some different suggestions for places that you can go to find, and some resources that we've kind of pulled together that we think are really useful and helpful for particularly with children and teens. How do you do this proclamation with them? There's a Kerygma for Kids workbook series that's out there. There's a couple different things. One of them I actually want to kick us off with, one of those resources I'll show you is just a short video that's really useful and helpful sometimes with like middle school and early high school age. So I'll show you that in just a second. But you go on this burningheartsdisciples.org, click on the link, and all this stuff will be here for you. All right? And then also you can contact, if you fill out contact info from this website to get in touch with me, feel free. If there's something I said that you couldn't find or you have questions about, I'm more than happy to share any of that with you. And Chad can get in touch with me as well. So just feel free to reach out. So remember I said, right, 7 to 9 different times people need to hear this proclamation. And I'm going to say in multiple different ways. The other thing that's important to know, and like I said on the website, we'll have broken down those 5 movements specifically for you, but it's more often, the longer you have with someone, the less likely you are that you're going to use all 5 movements at one time. Right? So you can spend like weeks on just the first movement and helping them really understand who is God, who am I, what does that mean, right, for me, what does it mean to be created in relationship, and what does that look like at an age-appropriate level? Because it's so important to make sure you get each one right before you move on to the next one, that people really have a chance to internalize it. You see how if you don't actually believe that God is a good father who loves you, then Jesus inviting you to relationship, it's off. It misses something. There's a piece in there that doesn't really connect or doesn't make sense to folks. So I would say my experience has been most people, you have to spend the longest on the first 2 movements. With most people, you have to spend the longest in the first 2 movements to help them really internalize those. Also, the younger someone is, the easier it is, because the less baggage they have coming into that, right? So that's just a couple of things. Alpha is a great resource for proclaiming the kerygma in like a little bit slower setting. There's an Alpha and an Alpha for youth as well. Again, it's Alpha, it's the beginning, right? It's not, this kerygma proclamation is not everything that we need to help people understand about the church or about theology or any of that. It's just this beginning initial proclamation that we have to make sure that people really understand, especially that invitation, to really speak the invitation into people's lives. So again, other resources that you can find on our site that help do that. But I want to move on. When we talked earlier about the 5th movement, right? This idea of Jesus bringing us to new life and the Holy Spirit being poured out into us, and that sends us on mission. One of the most powerful tools, I think, now let's be honest, I'm biased because I'm a former English major and literacy teacher. So I love stories of all kinds. But I think story has power in today's world in a different way than it has in previous generations. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. But I think story, just in general, is a powerful tool in an evangelizer's toolbox right now. And I mean that in every sense of the word. So stories from Scripture, stories from the lives of the saints, stories from your life, right? Personal witness story, or them getting to share their stories. But I also mean like pop culture stories, right? All over the place. We are surrounded with stories. And in a lot of cases, man, we have access to good storytelling today in a way that we didn't even when I was in middle school and high school. There's just so much of it out there. So I want to talk a little bit about the power of story and how we can use story to evangelize in a couple different ways this afternoon. But first I'm going to start with a story, a parable, a Yiddish folktale, actually it is. Once upon a time, Truth went about the streets as naked as the day he was born. As a result, no one would let him into their homes. Whenever people caught sight of him, they turned away and fled. One day, when Truth was sadly wandering about, he came upon Story. Now, Story was dressed in splendid clothes of beautiful colors. And Story, seeing Truth, said, Story, seeing Truth, said, "Tell me, neighbor, what makes you look so sad?" Truth replied bitterly, "Oh, brother, things are bad, very bad. I am old, very old, and no one wants to acknowledge me. No one wants anything to do with me." Hearing that, Story said, "People don't run away from you because you're old. I too am old, very old. But the older I get, the better people like me. Let me tell you my little secret. Everyone likes things disguised and prettied up a little bit. Let me lend you some splendid clothes like mine, and you'll see that the very people who pushed you aside will invite you into their homes and be glad of your company." Truth took Story's advice and put on the borrowed clothes. And from that time on, Truth and Story have gone hand in hand together, and everyone loves them. They make a happy pair. There's a reason that Jesus told stories, parables, in the scriptures over and over and over again. Because story has a way of revealing truth in a way that people can accept at the level they're ready for, and in a way that is non-threatening and not as intimidating. So I want to give you a couple of examples of some stories that have revealed truth in my life and in some powerful ways. But I won't have time to talk about all of them. But the first one up here, Inside Out. How many of you have seen the movie, the Pixar movie Inside Out, right? Okay. I absolutely love this movie for a very specific reason. When my youngest son was 4, 5, 6 years old, I don't remember exactly when it came out, but he had what my husband and I would have termed emotional regulation challenges. If any of you have kids, I feel like your third child is like the "you thought you knew what you were doing" child. He was still at 4, 5, and 6 years old having epic tantrums. And I'm like, what is going on? My other two, I knew how you dealt, right? You ignore tantrums because that doesn't help, right? And they calm themselves down and then you address the problem. But Isaac comes along and it's not working. Nothing that I've done before is working. He would go on an epic tantrum, get so upset about something, and we would do all the things, right? Your screaming hurts my ears. I need you to go into your bedroom until you can calm down or not scream so loud to hurt my ears, right? Be calm, send him up to his bedroom, and he would scream for 2 hours till he threw up or passed out. And I'm like, okay, this is not working. So my husband and I are just like not sure what to do with him, not sure how to help him. And really the issue is that he, when he was little, felt every emotion 100%. There was no a little bit angry. He would be furious. There wasn't even a little bit happy. He would be like bouncing off the walls, right? It was 0 to 100 all of the time, which is exhausting. And we were like frustrated, like how do we help this child, right? Because he hated it. He hated when he would lose his temper or when he would get so upset that he, couldn't function. And so we're at the movies, and we go see this Pixar movie, and it felt like this movie opened up a whole new world for us. And the next time Isaac had a tantrum, he was screaming, and I was trying to help him calm down, and finally I looked at him and I was like, Isaac, do you remember the movie? And he was like, yeah, he's screaming at me, right? Yeah. And I said, who's in charge right now in your head? Who's in charge? And he went, the red guy. Yup, I concur. And I just said to him, I said, do you remember in that movie when the red guy's in charge, he can't solve problems? I need somebody else in charge before we can fix this problem. I felt like I was, those of you who are my age will appreciate, I felt like I was like in Ghostbusters, right? Give me Dana. I need to talk to Dana. Somebody else has to be in charge for us to solve this problem. And so when someone else is in charge, then we can deal with it. And he got it. And that became shorthand for us to talk about his emotions and what he was feeling. Because that's, if you haven't seen the movie, each of those characters is an emotion that live inside an 8-year-old girl's brain. There's a big control panel. And whoever's in charge, that's the only emotion she feels. And it is actually a beautiful story about emotional regulation and like emotional health and how you need to have all of your emotions working together in order to be a healthy person. And instead, this girl usually has only one in charge at a time, and how they cause all kinds of problems for her. And then she has one she never wants in charge, which causes all kinds of problems for her. But this movie revealed truth, right, to us, to our family, and to my son in particular, at a level he could understand, and gave us language to talk about what he was having, what was going on. He wasn't at an age-appropriate level where he understood that disgust and fear and anger are 3 separate emotions that have different sources. Like, he couldn't do any of that, but he could tell me when the red guy was in charge or when the blue girl was in charge, right? And then we could talk about what do we do with those things. And to this day, I mean, he's 13 now, and every once in a while I'll look at him and go, red guy does not solve problems, remember? Now he just rolls his eyes at me and scoffs, but, right, like we still use that shorthand. So that's just a truth, right, that was like for our family, a profound truth, that story helped open up for us. The next one up here is Avengers. So I have 2 teenage boys, which means I know more than any 40-something-year-old adult woman should know about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because my boys were all into it, right? Like, we watched all of the movies in chronological order, in in-universe chronological order, which is not the same as the release date chronological order, before each of the big movies came out. All right? Multiple times I have watched or dozed through many of these movies. So I'm out with, we were at playing Frisbee golf with my oldest son and some of his friends. And they were friends from church. And we had been talking about some church-related stuff. I don't even remember what anymore. And all of a sudden, one of the boys goes, "You guys are Marvel people, right?" We were like, "Yeah, we're Marvel people." He goes, I think Iron Man has the best example of a discipleship story. And I was like, what? And he said, I think Iron Man. He goes, I really like Iron Man's story. He said, I feel like it's the most realistic of what it really means to like live this life. And I was like, okay, tell me more. And of course, my son is like, oh no, here she goes. I'm like, tell me more. And his friend tells me that the reason he likes Iron Man's story the most, for those of you who know anything about it, is that it's not neat. Like, Iron Man goes through like fits and starts. He like makes progress and then backslides, and he makes friends and then betrays them. And like, it's all over. His whole journey, his whole arc through MCU phase 1 is all over the place. And he said, and it takes him until the very end of the last movie that he's in to finally get it right. And I'm like, dang, kid, like, I think you're right. And he said, all the other stuff, all the other stories, movies we watch are those, he's like, those stupid, lame, religious Christian movies. And I was like, you're not wrong. And he's like, all of those, it's like 90 minutes of a nice, neat arc. And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, but his story is more like what life is like. I will tell you, I cannot see Iron Man now without thinking differently, and I don't think any of the other boys that were playing Frisbee golf will either. Because he totally took something. Now, that is not the creator's intent, I'm almost 100% certain, with Iron Man, right? But for this boy, it made a connection for him. He shared that connection with others, and now there's story out there that reveals truth about the life of discipleship for people. And for at least for a particular group of teenage boys that it wouldn't have before. Les Mis is, many of you I know are familiar with Les Mis. I had never I read the book. It's not great. I didn't love it. I read the book, and then the musical came out, right? And everyone was like, you have to watch it. And I was like, oh, well, I thought the book was so boring. Like, I don't know if I can do this. And one day, my boys were all gone hunting, and it was just my daughter and I. She was 9 or 10 years old at the time, sitting at home. And I was like, you know what? Now is a good time to start this because it's a musical. And it's not just a musical. It's like everything is sung. It's not they break out in song randomly. Everything is sung musical. And she would like to watch that with me, and the boys would revolt if we tried to watch it. So I'm like, oh, we'll give it a shot. I don't recommend watching movies with your 10-year-old daughter before you have ever seen them. There are some scenes in Les Mis that I was like, oh, close your eyes. That's not appropriate for you. But we get to the end of this movie. We both loved it. And we get to the end, and my daughter is crying. And she's not a crier usually about that kind of stuff, but she's crying. And I looked over, I said, like, oh, what's going on? And she's like, Mom, she's like, he couldn't accept forgiveness. That was her, like, he couldn't accept forgiveness. So one of the characters ends up committing suicide because he cannot accept forgiveness at the end of that story, right? The other character does accept forgiveness and ends up having this incredibly beautiful life. And she's like, it just shows how bad it is if you don't let yourself be forgiven. Like 9 or 10 years old. I could have told her that message, right? But here, this movie and the story of it all completely shifted her perspective and her understanding of that in a different way. Now, I will tell you at 16, she's heard me tell that story, and she goes, I didn't say that. I'm like, yes, you did. I promise you did. But it was a profound in that moment story for her. The last one I'm going to mention briefly is Subnautica, and the reason I want to mention it is a video game. It's not a movie, it's not a book, it's a video game. I have a love-hate relationship with technology. I love it with myself, and I hate it with my kids. I get that they need to know how to use it, but I feel like we're in constant screen time battles in our house. Well, then COVID hit, and it was like all the battles we've stopped fighting because there's no point. My kids' school went into lockdown in March, right, when everything hit. They went back to school the next fall in like every other day, hybrid versus in school, for like a month, and then it shut down again completely and stayed shut down for a long time. So they were home for a long time. And my sister's kids, because of the job my brother-in-law had at the time, and my sister was a nurse, her 4 kids were at my house. My 3 kids were at my house. I work from home, so doing all virtual learning. From kindergarten to sophomore in high school, in my house doing virtual learning. It was insane. It was one of those moments where people go, I don't know how you did it. And I'm like, me either. You just did. You didn't have another choice. But my oldest son, COVID was not good for him. It was not good for him. My daughter had no problem. She could take it or leave it. I think my youngest son actually preferred virtual learning because he's like, I don't have to worry about people being dumb. But my oldest son, it was so not good for him. He was like failing classes and not getting assignments done and all of it. And I'm trying to help manage all these other kids, and so did not have the time and energy to give to him. Felt like every day I was like looking at his assignment list and nagging him about things that needed to get done. So after all this is over, maybe a year later, we're in an event at church where my son gets asked to give a witness talk. And the witness talk my son gave that day was about, he started off, he's like, well, Mom, I know you're here listening to this, and I'm really sorry because you didn't know any of this was going on. He said, but basically the reason I was failing out of all my classes during COVID was because I was depressed, and I decided with that depression that what I was going to do was just play this video game, Subnautica. He goes, I played the entire game, like finished it in like 2 months, which was, he's like, you don't want to know how many hours a day I spent just playing this video game. He's like, that's why I wasn't getting anything done. But when he told his witness story, he said, but what happened was I finished the game and then got depressed because I didn't have anything else to do. And he said, so I went back and started doing side quests, or whatever he called them, in the game. And he said, and one day I was sitting there and my character was spinning around looking at this video game world, underwater alien world that had been created. And he said, and it was just beautiful. And I'm like, you are 17 years old and do not use the word beautiful. Like, what's going on? He says, it was just beautiful. And he said, and then as I turned and looked, he goes, I could see outside the window of the room he was in, and I saw this like incredible filtering of light through the trees, sunlight through the trees. And he said, and I realized in that moment that as incredibly beautiful as this video game world was, that this person had created that I thought was so creative and talented, that God had created an incredibly beautiful world for me. And I was missing it because I spent all my time on a video game. He said, because I turned the video game off and I went outside. And he said, and that is what brought me out of the depression that I had been in COVID. So again, right, it's a video game. And look, he should not have spent all day every day playing this game. For sure he should not. But there was truth that was revealed to him in that story, profound truth that was able to bring him out of a really bad place. Unfortunately, their school let them take pass-fail on some of their classes. So he just squeaked by with passes, and it didn't affect his GPA, which I was happy about. But the point is that we need to be people who are reading and looking at and watching and engaging with story with a lens of our faith. Because trust me, you can take just about any story you find and find goodness in it, and find truth in it, and find beauty in it, and find oneness in it. We can find the transcendentals in good stories. And when we help kids do that, it changes their whole world, because they start to see those stories in that way too. And when one kid shares it, right? One kid like the Frisbee golf dude who was like, yeah, Iron Man's a disciple, or his journey of discipleship is more legit than anyone else's. Now, all those other kids that heard that are not going to ever see that story the same way either. This is the incredible truth that story can reveal. We have to be like story consumers. And then give kids the freedom to share stories with you that are meaningful and what truth they reveal, right? Help teach them how to find truth in stories. When I was doing youth ministry, I had a young man who came in. We would do bring your own music night because they hated the Christian rock we would play during our youth nights. And so one night we were like, you know what? Every once in a while we do a bring your own music then. But here's the deal. You bring your music and you have to tell us how this song relates to our faith. And as long as it doesn't have swear words in it, we'll listen to anything you want, as long as you can tell us how it relates to the faith. And we got a lot of Jesus Take the Wheel and, Unanswered Prayers by Garth Brooks. We got a lot of that stuff that was really obvious, right? But one kid one night brought in Ozzy Osbourne's Iron Man. And he's like, play it. And we're like, really? He's like, play it. And he said, the first 2 verses, it could be the story of Jesus. He goes, the 3rd verse, he kind of goes off and destroys the world then, so maybe not so much there. But he's like, the first two verses, if you listen to it, that could be Jesus he's talking about. We listen to it, I'm like, you know what? You're right. You're not wrong. And now every time I hear Ozzy Osbourne's Iron Man, I think of this young man and his that could be Jesus, till the 3rd verse. You're right. But when we give them that permission and help coach them and teach them how to find truth, beauty, goodness, and oneness in story, and then let them share that, they are so much more engaged, right? Even in stories that we would think have nothing to do with our faith at all, they can do that. And that, by the way, that is the vocation of the baptized. As the baptized, our call, not only to evangelize, right, and make disciples, but our call is to consecrate the world, to make holy that which is not already inside the church. The priest and deacon's job is to make holy what is inside the church. Our job is to make holy what's outside in the world. And so when we go out and claim these stories, or just pieces of them, right? They're never perfect analogies, and it's never total. But when we can claim pieces of them and make it holy, it totally changes people's perspective. So there's a lot of power in using story in that way, beyond just witness and stuff like that. But that's the next thing we're going to talk about is using witness stories, right? Our own stories of faith. Letting them share their stories of faith with one another. Story is more than just entertainment, okay? It sidesteps debate in today's world in a different way than it even used to a couple decades ago. It provokes interest. Madeleine L'Engle said Jesus was not a theologian, he was a God who told stories. Right? And even the parables that he told, there were times where people were like, we don't get it. That's one of my favorite examples in the Gospels, is where the disciples go to Jesus afterwards and are basically like, can you explain it to us, please? We didn't understand what truth you were trying to reveal in your story. But he did it because he's preaching to crowds, right? And so they're all over the place in their own journeys. And when he would tell those parables, it would engage people at the level they could engage at. And his stories were great because they could go at all different levels of depth. That's what was one of the things that's beautiful about his parables. You know, he was asked hundreds of questions in Scripture, in the Gospels. Jesus is asked hundreds of questions. There are only 4 times that he gives a direct answer to a question, and all 4 times he's responding to a Pharisee. Every other time he is asked a direct question, he answers with another question or with a story. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, once there was a man, right? Like once upon a time, essentially. That's how he would start and how he would answer people's questions. Because he knew that there was profound truth to be revealed at the level they could understand and accept. The other thing that stories can do is build relationship. I don't know if some of you have seen the Chosen series. I don't remember which season it's in, but there's this incredible example of them sitting around a campfire one night. It's the one where it's the guy tells Jesus the story. It's basically the story of the Good Samaritan. It's his story, and it's the way the writers of the show set it up. It's like Jesus repurposes that guy's story later as a parable, right? But it was this real story that happened to this man. So they're sitting around this campfire after having helped this guy plant his field or whatever, and they're talking about, and Jesus asks him. He literally says the words, "Tell me your story." And he kind of is like, I don't know if that... You don't really want to know him. I got a kind of sketchy background, all this kind of stuff. And Jesus looks at him and he says, this is what we do. We share life and share story together. There is something powerfully relationship building in that sharing of life stories with one another, of giving people that opportunity to share what has happened in their life. And quotes from the popes that agree with me. That's what's on the screen. It's not just me. I really like Pope Francis's, the light of faith is linked to concrete life stories. We have to make this real for us in our own lives. And one of the ways we do that is through our life stories. Story sharing is also sharing life. So one of my favorite scripture quotes about relationship and evangelizing and accompaniment is from 1 Thessalonians, where he says, like a mother feeding and looking after her own children, we felt so devoted and protective towards you and had come to love you so much that we were eager to hand over to you not only the good news, but our very lives as well. There's an emotional investment in evangelizing, right? There's a personal, of course there is, because what is love? To be a gift of self. So there's an investment of ourselves that goes in evangelizing people, of being authentic and vulnerable in a healthy way with good boundaries, right? Like, I'm not saying don't like share everything all over people, right? Like, you don't share everything, but to actually share parts of your life with people, it's important to do. That's what St. Paul is saying here, right? We don't just share the good news like it's something out there, but we share life with one another. We walk together on this journey. We do this together. You all probably actually already know the story of the pelican. I don't have to tell you about that, right? Lots of places I go, people don't know the pelican. The reason that they use a pelican in the church, often use a pelican in the church, is because a pelican mother, when she can't find food for her babies, will peck at her own breasts and her own stomach for the blood to come out, and that's what to have her babies eat so that they survive. That's why the pelican you see pelicans in churches, in mosaics and stuff like that, because of the imagery there of what God did, right? And Jesus and the blood and all of that is just pretty profound. Yeah. So that's right, another piece about sharing of stories that's so important. All right, this is the one I really like to talk about, though, why I think they matter today. So we are, as multiple people have said in the church most recently, we are not just in an age of change, we are at the change of an age right now. We're at the change of an age. And what does that mean? We're at a place in our culture around us where people are approaching it so radically differently, approaching everything in the world so radically differently than has been done in decades past. All right, there's a theologian that I know, Sister Marie Colby Zamora, who talks about this a lot, and this is her her explanation slide that will help jog your memory when you look at it later. But essentially, what it says is that the former context, the old way of thinking, the old worldview that people looked at the world through, lens that they looked at it through, the old one said, give me the definitions, laws, and authority, and that will inform how I choose to live my life. Right? That was just how people approached the world. Give me the authority, the definitions, the laws, the rules, all of that kind of stuff. You tell me what those are, and that's going to inform how I live my life. The new context is completely flipped on its head. Now it's, let me tell you about my life experience, and that will inform my definitions, rules, values, and authority. Okay, we're going to get really concrete, give you really specific examples of this, one inside the church and one not. When I was a baby, right, and I was crying and had a fever and was pulling on my ear, what did my mom do to figure out what should happen, what she should do about it? What do you think? Yeah, she took me to the doctor. Or she called her mom, right? What did she do? She said, who are my sources of authority on this? I'm going to go to those people. I'm going to get their wisdom because they are the holders of the definitions and the values and the rules and the laws of medicine in this case, right? That relates here. I'm going to ask them what I should do, and that will inform my decisions and how I choose to live my life. She'd take me to the doctor. The doctor would say probably is an ear infection, would give some antibiotics, right? Great. If she called her mom would say it sounds like an ear infection. You probably should take her to the doctor, right? And that's what she would do. Absolutely, right? So you see, right? Authority figure comes first, authority and definitions and rules, and that informs life experience. Now you get to someone like me. And people who are my age and similar, we're in a micro generation because we like to be special, the Zennials, right? But we kind of have a foot in both worlds of these two worldviews. We were the micro generation because we were raised alongside technology. Technology existed at the level when it was age appropriate for us, right? So we didn't have access to things before they were age appropriate to us. So I have a foot in both worlds. So when my kids are crying, have a fever, and tugging on their ear, and they're babies, what do? Absolutely, I did. I Googled the heck out of that. Right? Now, I still have this former context in my mind. So when I'm Googling, I'm looking for the pediatrician's office or the doctor, probably not WebMD because that was going to tell me they had typhoid or something crazy like that. But I was looking for the website that had authority, right? That was going to confirm what I thought I should probably do, which was take him to the doctor, which is usually what happened for me. Now, go to a young mom today. Brand new mom, has a baby, crying, pulling on her ear, fever. What does she do? She does not go to Google anymore. She goes to Snapchat, she goes to Instagram, and she's a young mom, she probably doesn't go to Facebook, but like her Facebook group, right? Nextdoor app, and she says, hey friends, yeah, this is what's happening. Who can tell me? Anyone have any recommendations? Anyone have any thoughts what I should do? And do you know who has the most authority in responding to that mom? It's not, a pediatrician who comes on and says, I am also a mother and in this group with you, and here's what I think you should do. The mom who has the most authority is the mom who says, let me tell you what worked for me. Now, this has happened to me twice since I started using this example about a year ago, where I have been in mommy Facebook groups, because I'm that age, we still use Facebook, just groups usually, and I see someone ask a question about ear infections, and one of the moms responds with, twice this has happened, did you know that garlic has antibacterial properties? If you put a clove of garlic in your baby's ear, and put like medical tape or a Band-Aid or something over it, let her sleep with the garlic clove in her ear tonight, and that'll clear it right up. That's what I did, and it works for me. Now, garlic does have antibacterial properties. That is not how they work, okay? Don't do this. This is horrible advice, a horrible idea. I'm not saying the mom who asked the question chose to do that, but I'm saying in that group, you can't tell that mom she's wrong, that you should not put garlic in your ear because it worked for her, and her life experience is the point of departure for everything else. And so if you can say, this is what worked for me, this is what happened to me, this is my life experience, you have authority to speak into a conversation, to speak into a situation. Now, I will tell you that the more gray hairs you have, not allow people to see, the more gray hairs you actually have, the harder it is to understand the new context. And the more likely you are to think that this new context is horrible and awful and is going to result in the end of the world, okay? I'm gonna tell you that's not necessarily true, right? It's not necessarily true. I gave you probably an unfair example to that culture as an example, but one is not better or worse. They just are. And they have good things and bad things about them. I'll give you my other example, which is in the old context, in order to evangelize on college campuses, they would start with the spiritual laws. There is such thing as an objective truth, right? And that's how they would evangelize. Why? Because that was the point of departure. And we did so much apologetics in that time. Why? Because you needed to understand the rules and definitions and laws and authority in order to be able to speak into someone's life. The beautiful news about this new context that we're in is you don't have to know it all to be able to evangelize. All you need now is a life story. Let me tell you what Jesus did for me. And I'll tell you the story I shared earlier about what happened to me on a racetrack in France when I was a teenager. I have shared that with teenagers when I was a youth minister. And if they knew me and I had good relationship with them, they would sort of believe me, but often would try to find other explanations for what I thought had happened. And they'd be like, well, but did the sun come out? Is that why you felt warm? Was it the wine? We didn't even have wine. There was no precious blood, right? They would ask all these follow-up questions, trying to figure out how it had happened and what had happened to me and all of that. Today, if I tell that same story to a group of teenagers, they believe that what I said happened the way I said it happened. They don't always believe all of the things I took from it. I'm not saying they believe that Jesus is really present in the Eucharist, but they believe that what I experienced actually happened to me. That's a whole new world that we live in. And this is you all familiar, right, with the Me Too movement, right? When people tell you something happened to them, you have to believe them. This is the culture. This is the world that we live in today. And like I said, there are good things and bad things about it. There are blessings and challenges, but we can embrace it as a church in evangelizing, in how we bring people into the faith by taking advantage of witness stories and witness experiences in a new way. And I don't mean you don't have to sit down and come up with your canned testimony, right? This is not a write down your 10-minute version and your 5-minute version and your 1-minute version. No. I'm saying what did Jesus do in your life last week? How have you seen God working yesterday, right? Just those simple things, and getting people to share those things opens up so many doors today. If you have examples of miracles that you've experienced, big ones or little ones, share those with people. Because again, while they might not necessarily agree with the conclusions you drew from that experience, they will be more likely to believe that what you say happened to you the way you said it happened to you. Because their entire worldview is built on that, right? So if they want you to believe them, they have to believe you. I will also tell you that if you work at all with grandparents who are struggling to engage with their grandchildren, which is something I hear about all the time, right? I just don't know how to talk to my grandkids. It's probably because they live in such wildly different contexts. And one of the most powerful things a grandparent can do today is just start telling their stories. We have a CD. My maternal grandfather was a POW in World War II. He was an Air Force navigator in a plane that was shot down over Frankfurt, Germany, 2 years before the end of the war. And he was in a POW camp and then went on death marches and all of the things. And there were about 3 stories that my grandpa would tell about his time in the war. And they were always the funny stories with happy endings. He had the same 3 that he would tell over and over again. And before he got dementia, my mom and her sisters hired a reporter to sit down and interview him and record all the stories of his time in the war, because they wanted to know, but knew he wouldn't ever tell them face to face. So they hired this reporter, and then all of us grandkids got copies of this CD that's got this interview with my grandfather on it. And I remember receiving that CD, and I knew my grandpa, and I love my grandpa, right? And I remember receiving it, and that was so cool. And I sat down and listened to it, and then I would pull little snippets in to share with teens on retreat or something like that, right? Look, he was 18 years old when this happened. You're about to be 18 years old. How are you going to respond to adversity in your life? And my grandpa was a faithful Catholic. He was raised Catholic. My great-grandmother, there were 15 kids in the family, and at that time there were only 3 sets of mysteries of the Rosary. And my grandmother had assigned each of her children a decade of the Rosary that they had to pray every day, just 1 decade, so that the whole family at the end of every day had prayed an entire Rosary, right? And when my grandpa's plane was shot down over Germany, my great-grandmother refused to let anyone else take his decade and pray it. She said, because if Jerry's alive, he's praying that mystery. I know it. And in the CD, we have my grandpa talking about that there were days that was actually the only thing that got him through the day. I have to pray my decade today. And he would wait till bedtime to do it on purpose. He'd wait till bedtime. They actually started calling him Father Jerry, because he would always kneel wherever they were sleeping, right? He would kneel down by his little spot, and he would say his 1 decade of the Rosary. And he says, it's part of what got me through each day, was knowing I have to do this, and I have to do it tomorrow, and I have to do it the next day, right? Really profound and powerful and incredible. And I listened to that CD all the way through 1 time. And then had, like I said, little snippets I would use on retreats and stuff like that. My kids never met my grandpa because he died just after my husband and I got married. And my oldest was doing a report on World War II in school and was like, I have to look up, he said something to me about I have to look up some interviews. And I was like, wait, I have interviews. I'm like, would you be interested? I could get the CD out. You could listen through. He's like, that would be awesome. My son listened to that CD so many times, and then it became the CD they wanted me to play in the car when we'd be driving places. All 3 of my kids wanted to hear my grandpa's story. And I'm like, you didn't even know him. You didn't even know him. But that's the power of story today. Like I said, I love my grandpa, and I know he prays for me, and I absolutely believe that. And I loved his stories, but they didn't have the same impact on my life that they had on my kids who never even knew him. Because that's the power that story has on this generation that's coming up. So we can use, right, our stories, other people's stories, encourage parents and grandparents to share stories, not lessons, stories with their kids. There's like sets of cards that we got from my kid's RE teacher, one of my kid's RE teachers. We got these sets of cards for the dinner table, and they're story prompts. They're not just like would you rather or like discussion, like icebreaker prompts, but they're literally story. Tell a story about a time when or whatever. And that to like encourage us to share. It made such a difference in our family to be really doing that without ulterior motives, because most of the time my husband and I share stories with our kids. It's like to teach a lesson, like learn from my mistakes or do what I did. But this is the power that it has today. So this is an encouragement for you to use stories. There's some great resources out there. I don't know if it's around still or not, but there was a series for a while that was called Pray Me a Story, that took children's books, like they did one with Horton Hears a Who, is the one I remember. And I think it was Loyola Press did it. They would take these children's books that were already published, already well-known children's books, and they would write like prayers to go along with the story. So just like bring it home, right? Tie it together, bring it, help kids make those faith connections to just these stories that they know about. So like I said, I'm a big believer in story, but then what that means is that we have to know our own stories of faith. We have to have examples that we can give of the things Jesus has done in our lives. We need to know, we need to be ready to give an answer when asked for the reason for our hope, right? I was at a parish one time about to give a parish mission, and we were going to be talking about sharing and witnessing and all that kind of stuff. And so the pastor was one of those that gets up before Mass, right, and does crowd work, whatever you call it, with people before Mass starts. And he was like, all right, he's like, so turn to somebody that sits near you and introduce yourself. Fine, all wonderful. And then he gave him some really innocuous question, like, tell him what your favorite animal is, right, or something like that. And then he went, now tell him one thing God did in your life this week. And everyone went, like it got silent in the church. And I talked with him and his staff about it later, and he goes, that was a wake-up call for me, he said, because clearly that's not something people are used to. Even just tell me what God did in your life this week was outside their comfort zones. We should be ready to tell what God did in my life this week. Where have I received healing, restoration, hope from Jesus? Now, again, please keep healthy boundaries, especially when you're doing this with kids. One of my rules of thumb is we should not share with people we are ministering to a place that we have not received healing yet. Okay? If it's a place you are looking for healing, find a peer to share that with or a mentor to share that with, but don't share with someone you're mentoring a place that you have not yet received healing, right? We don't want to bleed all over people. But we can share places where Jesus has done things, age appropriately, of course. Right? Okay, so I want to share just a brief little snippet of my story to give you an example of this. This is not a story, by the way, that I would share with kids or teenagers, because it's not really appropriate for them, but I think it's appropriate for you all. I used to say I'm a cradle Catholic, but that's not true. Nobody's a cradle Catholic. Everyone's a convert. I want you to hear me say this. Everyone is a convert, because every single person has to make the choice to be Catholic for themselves. Okay? No such thing. But my mom was Catholic, raised us in the church. I was a good kid, went to Catholic school, I told you all that. I had this profound experience at World Youth Day in France in 1997. But it didn't change the decisions I made in my life a ton. Right? It was a great, profound encounter moment, but it definitely wasn't conversion or anything like that. That actually came much later. I was asked to chaperone a trip when I was in college to a Steubenville youth conference for the teens at our parish. They said, will you help chaperone? I said, sure, I can do that, no problem. The youth minister had asked me if I would, before we left, take the girls into the chapel and give them a talk on what it meant to be a woman of God before we left. And I told him I would absolutely do that, and then promptly forgot that I had agreed to do that. And so we show up to leave on this bus trip, right, to the Steubenville Youth Conference, and he's like doing an opening prayer with everybody, and making sure everybody's bags are where they need to be, and then he says, okay, and now I'm going to take the gentlemen into the church, and Kristin is going to take the ladies down to the chapel. And I'm like, uh-oh. I forgot that I was going to do that. And so the girls are all filing down to the chapel, and I'm like walking really slowly, like, woman of God, woman of God, woman of God. Mary was a woman of God. I went to Catholic school. I know that I can find Mary in the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke, and I know how to find Luke in the Bible. So I grab the Bible, I open up, I get down to the chapel, I open up to Luke, right, the beginning of Luke, and proceed to read the story of the Annunciation. All the while in my head going, dear Lord, give me something to say when this is over, because I had no idea what to say. We got done reading the story, and I said to them, look, we're talking about what it means to be a woman of God. Mary was a woman of God. I said, and what that means is that she was a woman who said yes to God, even though she wasn't sure what it meant. And even though she had lots of questions and lots of doubts, she still trusted enough to say yes. And I am sure I said many other wonderful and life-changing things to those girls, but I don't remember anything else. We load up the buses, we leave, and we go to this conference. Now, right before we had left for this trip, my now husband had proposed to me. And I said yes. My sister's high school graduation party, he proposed. So my family could all be there. It was amazing. And I was like, yes, you bet. That's awesome. He was not Catholic, but was fine with me doing things in the church and going to Mass and all that kind of stuff. He had no problem with it. And I had said yes. And then as we leave for the Steubenville trip, I start to get cold feet, like bad cold feet. And we're sitting in prayer experience the first night, and I remember I am like panicking, and I'm like, what did I do? Like, I said yes to this guy. Did I just get caught up in the moment? Do I really want to be married to this guy? Is this the guy for me? Like, just one guy forever? Like, is this really, I was freaking out. And the next day, one of the teenagers on the trip came to me and said, Kristin, I want to go to reconciliation, but I haven't been since I was like in 5th grade. Will you go with me? And I was like, well, I can't go with you. I said, but I can go wait in the line with you, right? And like, be there as moral support, no problem. And if you've ever been to one of these conferences, it's like a gymnasium full of like chair pairings with the priests. And then this one in particular had who I refer to as the sacramental hostess, who was standing at the doorway. And as you got to her, she'd be like, and you can go here, and you can go here. And I think she did that so that like everyone didn't wait in line for like a Father Mike Schmitz kind of guy, right? Like to make sure everybody got filtered around and the line kept moving. And so I'm waiting in line with this teenage girl, and we had an examination of conscience in our like goodie bag. And so I talked to her about that, and I said, look, like you can literally sit down in front of this priest and say, I have no idea, I've not done this in years, help me. And he will walk you through it, it's gonna be just fine. And so we're standing there, working through this line, and I'm praying for her, and she'd ask me a question and I'd answer it. And we get up to the front to the hostess lady, and she takes the teenager and is like, you can go over there. And I'm standing at the door of this gym, and I'm like, look at her go, like this is so awesome. I was like super excited for her. And then the hostess turns to me and goes, and you can go over here. And I'm like, what? Oh, but see, I'm an oldest child, and that means I'm a rule follower, and I do what I'm told. I was not about to get out of line and be like, oh, not me, though. And so I go sit down with this priest who, in my memory, is 97 years old. And he was a Capuchin. He had the brown robe, right? And I sit down in front of him, and I'm just honest. I said, look, Father, I'm a chaperone here on this trip. I was standing in line with a teenager who was nervous to go. I am not even remotely prepared to give a confession. I didn't even think about myself this whole time I was waiting. And he was very sweet, and he says, that's no problem. He says, why don't you just tell me what's on your heart right now? And so I poured out all of these like fears and doubts and all this stuff I had been having about having gotten engaged. And when I got done, he looked at me and he said, I would like you to reflect on Our Lady of the Annunciation. who said yes to God, even though she had doubts and questions. And I was like, oh. I felt like I had lovingly and gently been hit upside the head with a 2x4. It's like, hey, dummy, pay attention. So that night we went to adoration. And I remember in adoration I would like to tell you that my fiat, right, let it be done to me according to your word. It's more like, fine. My yes to God, right, is more like, okay then. And so we're sitting in adoration that night, and I remember that was my prayer, was like, okay, yes. And yes to all of it, not just to getting married, but to this entire invitation that you've had for me this whole time. Fine, yes. And I went home, and yeah, my husband and I got married. It was wonderful, it was beautiful. It was not perfect, right? I was not like this amazing Christian because of that or anything like that, but it definitely was a changing point in my life. My husband and I get married, and very shortly after our wedding, we'd gotten life insurance with a friend of ours who sold life insurance. If you get married, let me tell you, your friends who sell life insurance are going to come out of the woodwork. One of our friends. I had to have blood work, you had to give blood work, right, to get your life insurance policy, to make sure it was whatever, that you're healthy enough. And I was also switching to my husband's health insurance at the time. So it was this whole thing of events that happened. And the life insurance came back and said my premium was going to be a little high because I had one elevated thing in my blood. And we were like, okay, whatever, fine. Well, then I'm going to meet with this doctor for the first time who's going to run some blood work. And I was like, actually, I just had a bunch of blood work run. Can I just bring you those results instead? And he's like, sure. In fact, I'll probably get more information than what I was going to run to begin with. He says, sure. So I probably faxed it at that time over to the doctor's office. And I get a call the next day. We need you to come in. I'm like, what? So I come in, I go meet with this doctor who says, your creatinine levels are elevated, which is not something he would have checked had I just done his blood work that he wanted to. He says, your creatinine levels are elevated. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. Through a whole series of events and testing and all that, we found out that I had kidney disease. I had chronic kidney disease. When my husband and I got married when I was 23 years old, my kidneys were functioning at 33% of their function. I had a mechanical defect in my kidneys that caused, anytime I got a bladder infection, it would go up into my kidney and scar my kidneys. And they were asymptomatic and didn't even know that they existed, didn't even know I had them, but it had caused all this long-term damage. So they fixed the defect so that I wouldn't get more infections, but once your kidney is damaged, it does not regenerate. It's one of the few organs in your body that does not heal. Once it's damaged, it's damaged. And when your blood pressure goes up because of your kidney not working, it causes more damage. Once there's a threshold you get to with kidney disease that it's going to keep getting worse, essentially. And so 23 years old, getting ready to start our new family, they say, if you're going to have kids, you should do it right away. Because there's medication we can put you on that will help prevent some of this from getting worse, but you can't get pregnant if you have it. And we don't know how long your kidneys are going to last. So if you want to do this, you should do it right now. We hadn't really talked yet or thought about when we were going to start the rest of the family, but okay. So we do that. We were very, very fortunate, got pregnant right away with my oldest son, almost as soon as we started trying. And I had to see both my nephrologist and my OB. It was a high-risk pregnancy because when the baby's small enough, it uses the mom's kidney, right? Kidneys to function. Then the baby's kidneys grow, but there's this spot where the mom's kidneys can start to show strain. And so they were keeping an eye on all these things. So I was 36 weeks pregnant, and I went in for my OB appointment, and my doctor said, I just heard from your nephrologist, your kidneys are starting to show strain. We're going to need to induce labor so that your kidneys don't get damaged from this pregnancy. Okay. She said, come in Monday morning at 8 o'clock, and we'll do your induction. I was like, all right, this is happening. Sunday night at 6 p.m., my water broke on its own. I went into labor, had natural labor. It was wonderful. It was beautiful. This is my memory of it. Right? And I had this amazing, happy, healthy, bouncing boy. What my husband will tell you, we've given this talk together before, what my husband will tell you happened is that just after I delivered the baby, I started hemorrhaging, and I threw up and had to get whisked away for an emergency D&C. And because he was 4 weeks early, our son was not breathing as well as they wanted, so they wanted to go put him under an oxygen tent in the nursery. So within an hour of having had this newborn baby, my husband was standing in a hospital room by himself. His baby's off in the nursery, and his wife's off getting an emergency D&C from retained placenta. At that moment is when our parish pastor showed up to come visit because he'd heard we were in the hospital. I never saw our parish, I worked church then, never saw our parish pastor. He sat there and waited with my husband till I got out of surgery and then left. It was beautiful. But 6 weeks later, they're checking my kidneys. Was there any damage, any additional damage? And no, my kidneys were great. There was no additional damage. And I'm like, yes, praise God, this is awesome. So about a year and a half later, we're like, we should go for number 2. Same thing. I had no problem getting pregnant, 36 weeks. The OB says, your nephrologist called, we need to induce on a Monday morning. I'll see you at 8 o'clock. Sunday night, my water broke. I went into labor. I'm like, this time, no problems, no complications, no issues, no nothing. We bring home our happy, healthy, bouncing baby girl. Everything is wonderful. 6 weeks later, we go in and this is great. My kidneys have no damage. Now, my husband and I's reaction to that was very different because my reaction was, see, God takes care of us. This is amazing. We can have as many of these babies as we want. My husband's reaction to that was, we got a healthy baby boy, a healthy baby girl. We rolled the dice twice and got lucky. I don't think we should roll it anymore. And we were not on the same page with that, even remotely. Not only did I want more kids, but also he had converted to Catholicism. The pastor who he met in the hospital room actually did workouts with him. They lifted weights together and did RCIA over weightlifting and brought him into the church. But it was like it's my husband's story to tell, right? But it was a sort of conversion. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was a sort of. There was a lot of good things about it, but there was stuff he was still not so sure about. And I didn't know any of that at the time. I was just like, yeah, he's Catholic, and I'm Catholic, and we don't believe in contraception, so we have to do NFP if we're going to try to not have babies. And I am just arrogant enough to think, and I can do that. I'll read the book. There's a book. I'll read the book. I can do NFP. You can't do NFP by reading the book. We spent about 2 years, though, battling, because while I was willing to do the NFP stuff, I still wanted more kids. And I was so angry at him that he was not willing to do that at all. And we were just at this, like, battleground between the two of us. We were, like, having shouting matches that were about anything but what we were really fighting about, and just all over the place. And it got to a point where I was like, I think we need to go get help. And so we agreed to make an appointment with a marriage counselor. We went in and met with this marriage counselor, and I remember vividly one of the first questions after we kind of shared our story and why we were there, she turned to my husband and she said, is this a marriage-ending issue for you? And I remember vividly, he looked at her and goes, it might be. Because he was pissed, right? Like, he was angry and frustrated, and I know that. That's where it was coming from. And she looked at me and she said, is this a marriage-ending issue for you? And I said, no, it can't be. And I went home and I bawled that night because I thought I was going to have to sacrifice not only my desire to have more children, but, like, my moral beliefs in what was okay. Because my husband did not think NFP was going to work. He's like, I know that's how Catholics have babies. Like, no, that's what happens there. He's like, that's not going to work. And so I was like, I'm going to have to sacrifice all of this in order to save this marriage. And where are we going to be at the end of it? So we had like 3 more appointments with this marriage counselor. And the third appointment, my husband tells a story really funny. He's sitting in the waiting room waiting for me, and I'm late. He would say, like always. And he said, I walked off the elevator, and he looked at me, and I looked white as a ghost. And he said, he looked at me and said, what? And I looked back at him and said, I'm pregnant. I had just found out that I was expecting our 3rd child. And I actually had been not feeling well and made an appointment to go see the doctor. And they were like, well, you have to take a pregnancy test first because of the age and all that. And I was like, I'm not pregnant. I'm not. This is something else. I took the pregnancy test. I was. I'm like, oh no. So, and I found that out at the office right before I left to go meet my husband at the marriage counseling appointment. So just as I say that, he says, "You're pregnant." And I went, "Uh-huh." The lady walks out of the office, and she's like, "Hey, come on back." This poor lady, I still to this day feel so bad for her. We sit down, and she goes, "Okay, so where do things stand today?" And my husband goes, "I just found out she's pregnant." And the marriage counselor says, when you say just, he goes, "In the waiting room." And she said, "Oh my, why don't we just sit with this for a minute?" And then we sat like for maybe 60 seconds in silence, right? And my husband got up and he looked at her and he goes, "Well, we don't need to be here anymore. Bill me for the session." And he walked out. He walked out and made his appointment to go get a vasectomy. He was like, "Nope." And in his mind, it was, you don't care enough or know enough to be able to take care of yourself. I have to do it for you. That was his mindset. I said nothing. We didn't even really talk about the issue anymore, right, after that. He, to this day, feels horrible about how he responded in that moment, but we were happy to have, like, another baby, right? It wasn't like this didn't get taken out on a child or anything like that. But he's like, I'm going to go take care of this permanently now so that this does not become an issue again. 36 weeks pregnant, my OB calls. Actually, she said to me this time, "So your kidneys are showing strains, so we're going to schedule your induction for 8 o'clock on Monday morning, and I'll see you Sunday." Sure enough, my water broke on Sunday, and I went in and like had Isaac, and again, super healthy. Everything was great. Everything was wonderful. 6 weeks later, we go for follow-up, and my kidneys show no damage. And now, what was fear and anxiety and uncertainty turned into anger, which turned into bitterness, right? And just this like sense of this awful betrayal. And I was so angry and so bitter at my husband. And I remember actually having an argument with him at one point after he had had the vasectomy, after Isaac was born. And I said to him, "You don't know what you've done to me." I said, "Every time we're together, you're stealing sacramental graces from me." And he shouted back at me, "I don't know what that means." But I was so upset. And it got to the point where like even other people telling me that they were pregnant would just bring it all back. And I would take it all out on him every time, right? I remember meeting with a friend of mine and telling her, well, she was one of the few people that kind of knew what was going on, and saying, I don't know what to do. And she was like, "Well, Kristin, you have to forgive your husband." And I'm like, I know that that's what I have to do here, or this marriage is going to be over. But I don't know how. I don't know how to forgive him when I feel like every single month I have a reminder of what he did and what we'll never have again. I said, "I don't know how to forgive." And she went, "Well, I don't know." But then later she said to me, she goes, "I don't know, maybe this will work." And she really was just like throwing ideas up against the wall, see what sticks, right? She's like, "Maybe this will work." She goes, "What if you faked it?" I'm like, "Fake what?" She goes, "Fake forgiving him." I go, what are you talking about? She goes, "What if you act like you've forgiven him? And you like try to pretend like you've forgiven him." And then she said, this is where she said the key word, Holy Spirit inspired. She said, "And every time you do, ask Jesus to forgive him for you." And I was like, I will try anything. So this is what I did. Not perfectly, whatever, but every time I found myself getting angry or upset or something would trigger, I'd be like, all right, I'm just going to pretend like everything's okay. And then I'm going to say, "Jesus, I need you to forgive him because I can't and I don't know how." Fast forward about a year, and my sister comes to tell me that she's expecting their fourth child, unexpected but happy, right? Totally unexpected but very happy. And she had no idea any of this was going on in our life, but she tells me this, and I was happy for her. For one of the first times, just happy for someone and I was like, oh my gosh, I called my friend and go, "It worked." So my sister just told me she was pregnant, and I didn't feel upset. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel like I wanted to lash out at my husband at all. She was like, "That's amazing." And my husband gets home from work, and I'm like, Steph is expecting. And he went, "Okay." Like he was terrified because he knew that like this was not going to be good. And it was like a month or so, and he was like, "So we're good?" And I'm like, we're good. And then we get asked to join this is like, sometimes you think about how crazy things are. We got asked to join the engaged couples ministry at our parish and help with the retreat And we said yes, because we're a good Catholic, right, couple. And we had to, other than this marriage counselor and one of my friends, nobody else knew that all this was going on behind the scenes in our marriage. And so we're at this retreat, and we're asked to give a witness talk on the retreat. And I remember driving to it, and I'm like, I think we should talk about the vasectomy. And he's like, what? I said, I think that's what we should talk about. And in the car on the way to the retreat was the first time I told my husband, like, what had happened. And he tells me in the car on the way to the retreat, he goes, that's crazy. He goes, the day I came home and you told me your sister was expecting, he said, I'd gone to confession for the first time for this. Right? God is good. And so that, like, completely shifted things for us. And just changed so much in our marriage and understanding what forgiveness looks like, right? And how to overcome and just all of it. And now, like I said, this is a talk that we sometimes give together. We talk about what forgiveness looks like and how to overcome it. But my kidneys are still damaged. Actually just got approved for the transplant list. I don't actually have to get a transplant yet. I'm somewhere between 1 and 5 years away. They don't know for sure because things can change, but none of this is a stressor for us in the same way that it was. Now this is all stuff that has just brought us closer together as a couple. And really having learned how to forgive and learned that I can't do it. That was the biggest lesson for me. I can't do it by myself. I actually had to ask Jesus to do it for me in order for it to happen. And it happened without me kind of knowing that it was happening until it was done. It was like, oh my gosh, it worked. It happened. And my husband's story is very similar into how his kind of realizing that he had betrayed me and had to go to confession, all of that kind of came about. But I share that story with you to say, like, when we share our stories, first of all, clearly not a story I will tell teenagers, right, or kids or anything like that, because it's not appropriate to them. But two, this is why I have women coming out of the woodwork telling me their husbands cheated on them and asking for advice and help, right? Because I was betrayed, and I had felt betrayed and received healing from Jesus for that. Like, he healed that for me. And so that's what I have to offer now, other women in particular. That's usually how it shows up, is to say, this is what he did for me. Maybe you could try it, and maybe it'll work for you as well, right? That's evangelization. Let me tell you what worked for me. Maybe it'll work for you too. And then the other reason I tell that story is to ask you for continued prayers, right? For our kids and for my kidneys and all that kind of stuff. My husband told me I have to do that. Anytime he's okay with me telling the story every time. He said, but every time you have to ask people to pray for your kidneys. So please pray for my kidneys. Lastly, when you think about how to share your story, we're going to skip a bunch of slides here because I want to get to the good one, this one. When you think about how to share your story of healing or restoration or wholeness or little or big miracles that have happened in your life, make sure Jesus is the protagonist of your story, okay? It would be really easy for me to tell that story and use shorthand to make it sound like, right, I was feeling this way, and then I forgave my husband, and now things are better, and to make it about me. But it took time for me to recognize and be able to speak specifically to what Jesus did to make that shift happen. We do that a lot in church world, by the way. We do shorthand for I went to Mass, I went to confession, I said a prayer, right? And then we don't actually say, but what did Jesus do in that Mass, in that confession, in that prayer, right? Like, make him the focus of the story. We cannot assume that people know that when I say I went to Mass, we're talking about, right, like the power of Jesus in the Eucharist and what he did for me. We actually have to speak it and be very explicit about it. But this is a really short framework that you can use to start, like, thinking about how to share your story and what to say and how to do it, how to coach kids to share their story. I was, Jesus did, and now I am. This also makes a great prayer if you flip it on the, like, something I need healing for, right? Jesus, I am. Jesus, I need you to, so that I can, right? It's very, very short framework. And have more than one story. My dad talks about how we have like an accordion of our life, right? Very rarely are you going to be called to pull out the entire accordion. Like, have your little bits that you know for the audience that you have, for the like lesson you're trying to impart, whatever it is, right? The circumstance. Have a couple different little things that you can pull out, but this framework can be a helpful way of thinking about it. That's why we don't do canned testimony. I tell my story frequently. It never sounds the same anytime I tell it, right? Because the Holy Spirit moves and different things come out and different elements of the story get brought to the forefront. So be obedient, listening to the Holy Spirit, but use story as a way to evangelize, to reveal truth, and to share relationship and witness with one another, both in your adult relationships and with the students that you have. And teach them how to find truth, beauty, goodness, and oneness in story, and how to share their own stories of what God has done in their lives, right? There will be resources for all of this on our website, including like a sheet that walks through this simple story structure, some additional like packets if you want to go deeper in trying to unpack your story and figure out what pieces might be helpful for you. We'll have all that stuff on our website. There is the link in case you did not yet write it down.